now, and we're going. So, as you all know, conversation is what is not sick enough for today. There's kind of a loose plan on the way the direction the conversation is going to go. So we'll just see where the conversation takes us, basically, based on a few things that we've got some points for you. So if we go over the guidelines, it is you're welcome to contribute as much as or a little as you want. As I said before, it's been recorded. When talking about weight and numbers, try and replace numbers with X's. Just be mindful of triggering content, but with the subject that we're talking about, it's kind of hard not to talk about some of those things.
Bless you.
Be kind and respectful, here, and also keep yourself safe. And that's pretty much all of it for this one. We wanted it to be a bit more open than the group meetings that we generally have, so it's up to you guys what you want to share and what you don't want to share.
So the things that we're going to cover are what's not sick enough for treatment, what's not sick enough for recovery, how BMI and weight affect perceptions by health professionals, and what the kind of impact of the idea of not being sick enough is. So that's the kind of vague structure of it. I expect there'll be kind of other factors that we need to talk about and that people want to talk about, but that's kind of the structure that we're following.
Cool. So next slide. So I think we're going to start off with what it means to not be sick enough for recovery. So we've got a few things that we've looked up on the internet, the way people are speaking about treatment. So it's about how people think that maybe because of their weight or because of the way that their behaviours are, that they don't deserve recovery yet, or they're not sick enough for recovery. So if we just go over some of these statements. So the first one is, it's late and I'm tired, so I'm not going to type out a really long explanation. But recently I've just been so, excuse the language, fucking done with all of this. But I feel like even if I wanted to, I could never recover before I looked really sick. Do you know what I mean? Like, what's the fucking point of getting better if I'm not proper underweight? Even. And then the next one is, I never stopped feeling this way. Even now that I'm underweight, I don't feel like I'm underweight enough. Even if I sometimes worry to death over people with a higher BMI and overall better health than mine, it's like all logic and rational thoughts fail me. And I've always been stuck with this stupid double standard towards myself. I want to look sick before I feel worthy of recovery. And then not being sick enough is the context of this one as well. This is basically the main, if not only thing that is keeping me from recovery. And I just want someone to step in and take me out of this and make me feel like I've done a good enough job to leave my eating disorder for good. It's like I feel like I need to hit rock bottom and I need someone to tell me when that point is. So some of those are quite difficult. I think they're quite a reflection on all the things that we were looking up online. I know that there is a lot of this kind of talk in eating disorder communities, online communities. It's something that I think has resonated with me.
Yeah, definitely.
And possibly for some of you guys as well, about how it feels when you're trying to go from feeling like you have an eating problem and then not wanting to go until you're at a dire point, and that treatment is something only for the really, really sick. So I don't know what your guys' feelings on that is. If anyone wants to speak, raise their hand or talk. No? Okay. We were also looking at an article that also said that people with eating disorders generally have that their brain worked in a different way, where their perception was different to pain and internal signals of pain. So I think it was the insula, part of the brain called the insula, that just didn't, it wasn't working the same as normal subjects, and that whenever things like when people feel faint or feel unwell, they don't
Acknowledge it as an issue.
Acknowledge it as an issue as much as someone else. So I think that's also
kind of it skews the perception of how sick you think you are, kind of in comparison to other people or against a certain set of guidelines or restrictions about being sick. So you're kind of, I'm not as sick as that person, therefore I'm fine, or I'm not this and therefore I'm fine. Which is kind of damaging for the person.
Damaging for the person. I think when it comes to, I think the other thing that we were looking up is this big thing about otherwise specified feeding and eating disorder, so not fitting into a certain category, so not fitting into maybe anorexia or bulimia or binge eating disorder,
and therefore not thinking you've got a problem.
And then the fact that that actual diagnosis not being enough in itself, and that to actually have something more substantial of a diagnosis like anorexia or bulimia would somehow
validate it more,
and
make you kind of more that you count more as being unwell.
That's also the general feeling of it. So if you guys have any comments, you can type in the chat box if you want to speak about this subject before we move on to treatment of eating disorders rather than not sick enough for recovery. Not sick enough for treatment. So when we're talking about GPs and health professionals and the way that's dealt with instead of this kind of side of it, just let us know. No? So shall we move on to
So it's important to kind of think when you're talking about treatment and not being quick enough for treatment, that it's been identified that it's really important to get an early diagnosis when you're looking at recovery, because if it's going on for a long time, then the illness is just likely to get worse and worse. And often if somebody's seeking help with their eating disorder or eating difficulties, then for them it's already become unbearable. They've been dealing with it for long enough, and it's important to acknowledge how somebody feels about their illness for themselves. And unfortunately there is this kind of idea of not sick enough for people against themselves, but also from a medical profession point of view as well. And if the illness isn't dealt with earlier on, then it can become more ingrained and it becomes worse as well.
They have been putting in guidelines for young people more so than adults, which I think it's kind of hard. Young people definitely do need to have treatment, obviously, but I just don't think that there should be such a difference between young people and adults, and especially the difference between when you come from CAMS treatment into adult treatment. There is such a difference.
People often feel like they've been lost in the in-between as well, in that kind of progression from CAMS to adult treatment, because the guidelines are different for how you deal with it.
But I mean, there's been many occasions that we've seen on articles on the internet from my own experience that going when people have been not as underweight as other people, or I think one of the biggest things that I saw was a person that had gone to their doctors and she'd had it's kind of an unrelated point, but it leads to a good point, is that she'd had a nasty accident when she was younger, damaged her back, and had kind of unrelenting issues. And each time that she went to the doctor because she was overweight, they said that the source of her pain was because that she was overweight, and that she needed to lose weight in order for the pain to dissipate. So she began to over-exercise, have disordered eating, and was just still struggling with the pain. And the more that she exercised, the more that the pain was. V, I see you want to raise your hand and speak.
Just to reiterate your point, there's so many articles now available about people living in larger bodies going to their doctors with all sorts of aches and pains. There's a woman recently who wrote her own obituary because she'd been saying for years that she had this horrible pain in her stomach, and the doctor kept saying it's because she was fat. It was because she was fat. That's all the issue was. And then 2 weeks before she died, they found out she had a massive tumour in her stomach. And she wrote the obituary and said about, that's what she was being judged on, was just how she looked and her size, rather than actually seeing her as an individual and taking into account the medical issues that there were. Too often people go, and like you've been saying, people saying they're not thin enough, they're not underweight enough. And the same is true of the other side. I could probably find you dozens of articles of people in larger bodies saying they're not getting the treatment either.
Yeah, that's kind of the point that we were going on this one, was because that she went to the doctors, and she went to the doctor several times, having really struggled out with and exercising issues to try and decrease her weight to stop the pain, and it wasn't doing anything. It was making the pain worse. And then she went back and she finally got the MRI that she needed, and found out that the muscles in her back weren't working properly, that the discs were crumbling, and actually it wasn't due to the size of her body. It was due to the accident that she had when she was younger. And there was a similar case to that with a plus size model called Ellie Mayday, who was going to the doctor for several times for pain, but she was overweight. She was larger body. They judged her on the BMI and told her to lose all the weight, and it turned out that she had ovarian cancer.
It just goes to show how weight plays such a big part, kind of across the board, not just when you're talking about eating disorders, but when you're talking about other health conditions as well. How doctors use weight as a judgment, I guess, of all sorts of different things.
And this is one of the facts that we found out, was that on a University of Washington, so it might be America, but it probably translates over here, is that over 2,000 medical practitioners reveal that doctors have similar levels of anti-fat bias as the general public, and that people in larger bodies who have an eating disorder don't receive the diagnosis or treatment that they need, since they don't fit the classical idea of someone with a thinner frame. And so someone else, one of the articles that we did read was that someone went to the doctors saying that she'd been struggling with her eating for a long time, and she was in a larger frame, and they basically put her on a diet and told her that she needed to be on medication to suppress her appetite, and that would fix it all.
Yeah, which is just shows how large the level of misunderstanding is in medical professions when it comes to eating disorders, and that there are people who do get it, and from kind of what we've seen, it can seem that lots of medical professionals that are high up really do get it and are putting out guidelines based on that, but that's not necessarily filtering down into your general practitioners, who are the first people that you generally see. So you go to your GP because you're struggling in whatever way it is, and they don't have necessarily the right level of training or level of understanding when it comes to eating disorders, because they have to know such a broad spectrum of things in order to help people. But eating disorders seem a little kind of neglected on the keeping up to date with the most recent recommendations on how to deal with eating disorders, recognizing eating disorders. And I think it was the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence in NICE, and their current guidelines are to say that doctors are told not to measure not to use measures such as a person's body mass index, or how long they've been ill to determine whether or not to offer treatment, and to ensure that they're giving help at the earliest opportunity. So it does go to show that, like, and the NHS follow these guidelines as well. So it goes to show that the intention is there, but not necessarily the time and education for people.
So the funding, isn't it? I think it was a big funding issue of people being sent, even the people that are drastic cases, emergency cases, they're being sent away to beds far away.
5-hour journeys away from their families.
That people that are the emergency cases are being rushed into the treatment before the people that are lower down on the list. It's a case of funding and it's a case of beds. But then when you get into treatment, there was something we were discussing before we came on, with that treatment also doesn't necessarily focus on the mental side of things. It focuses on weight restoration. And I think from some of the forums that I was reading, that people shouldn't want to try and be in that kind of treatment, and that it can seem like a goalpost to people, but actually that kind of treatment doesn't necessarily address the things that it needs to address as well. So.
And it kind of puts that, it forces the focus onto weight as well. So if you're talking about weight restoration as a form of recovery, it forces the focus in the general public and for doctors and for the people who are suffering into weight restoration or weight in general. And if you're doing that, then people who are unwell, as you kind of saw from the forum messages, are much more likely to kind of set it as a goalpost, as a kind of, right, I need to, in order to be ill, in order to be sick, in order to leave my eating disorder behind, I need to be this weight. Mm-hmm. And then I'm valid. Like, I'm valid as somebody who has an eating disorder. I recognise an eating disorder. And that's the other thing as well, is kind of eating disorders and eating difficulties take so many different forms. Yeah. And yet the ones that are focused on in the kind of general public and in the medical profession are anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, also becoming slightly more recognised, but not as much as it should be, and binge eating disorder. But
and ARFID.
And ARFID. There are so many, but the focused on ones are the ones that are kind of more spoken about in pop culture and in media. And those ones often focus on this kind of idea of a skinny teenage girl with bones and all of that sort of thing, and not on the fact that actually if you're struggling, you're struggling. And that should be the main focus of medical professions, is that you're suffering.
Yeah, and I think it's about validation as well. So a lot of people, they said that they just wanted the validation of their eating difficulties and what they've been struggling with. And that, you know, when you have these two hands, one is for people that think that they're not sick enough for recovery, and then people, there's the health professionals that saying you're not sick enough for treatment. They're kind of validating the kind of sick belief that they're not sick enough for treatment. So it's this double-edged thing that's going on here, and actually they should be trying to harmonize it. So, you know, treatment could come in all shapes and all forms, and it doesn't necessarily need to be that you need to go through inpatient treatment or anything like that. It's about finding other things for people that, you know, work, and actually having a doctor or a nurse or some health professional saying, yes, we hear you, and what you're saying to me is what you're saying to me. You're obviously struggling with this. It's just, there just seems to be a bit of an impasse between the two.
And also people, like the general conception is that in order for your eating disorder to be valid, you do need to have a diagnosis. Mm-hmm. And it's just not true. And it does also mean that if someone considers themselves not sick enough, then they're not necessarily going to seek the help when they actually need it. So when they're starting to worry that their behaviours and their thoughts might not be healthy, is when people should be seeking support, not necessarily medical treatment, but support from kind of support groups like ours, from therapists, from hypnotherapists, like from all of that sort of thing, just trying something to help them out. But people go to the doctor straight away, and that's not necessarily the right path for everyone.
Yeah, I think that sick enough should be how you're feeling.
Yeah.
Sick enough just should kind of be eradicated. It's one of the main things that people with an eating difficulty will think, is that this isn't a problem.
Yeah, I'm fine. Okay. I'm not like the others.
Yes. It might be that you don't fit a certain diagnosis, but it is about,
how you feel.
How you feel. And I can't remember. I'll see if I can find it. There was a very, very good quote that. Ooh. There is that one. The truth is, not feeling sick enough or deserving enough of help is actually a classic symptom of a strong eating disorder. It is evidence of the eating disorder's bid for power over your life. That's not the one that I was looking for, but I'll see if I can find it later. The other point that I was going to raise was that there was another article with a male that was older. I think he was in his 60s. Who had all the physical symptoms, but because he was a male and older, wasn't treated like an eating disorder of any kind could be a problem or could apply to him, which again, I think it's about
skinny teenage girl thing.
It's a skinny teenage girl thing. So is there
any feedback
that anyone would like to add to the conversation? Don't have to. I think is that pretty much everything?
Yeah, I think so. Is there anything else that anyone wants to add?
There is. Just let us know, or we'll be posting some of the links.
Ruth's raising her hand.
Hi.
Hi, Ruth.
As you know, I'm a hypnotherapist for those that don't know me, and from the people I see that come perhaps to lose weight, quite often that really isn't the issue at all. When they do come and you put them into hypnosis, and under hypnosis you can find out what their true reasons is from their subconscious, and more often not, the weight is not anything to do with their problem. And when you do sort of find out what the cause is of their weight issue, whether it's been abuse or whatever, or something that may have happened years ago, even just like one comment from somebody, and you sort that out, the weight is no longer a problem for them in any way. And I think that's the problem with the GPs. They're just seeing a solution. They're not really looking for the problems, perhaps.
I think it's
making assumptions.
I think it's very true. I think there's been a number of comments said to me over the course of it. One of them was by a doctor who said, "You're not doing anything silly like making yourself sick.
Are you?
And I was like, if I were, I'm not going to tell you now.
No, just the way the words they use, the language they use is not good. And a lot, not for everybody obviously, but a lot of them, their language isn't good. And like you said, it just gets your goat up straight away. The rapport's gone, and they've got no chance. You've just put not you personally, but one's put the blank wall up, and they're not going to get anywhere. They just want to get out the door.
No, exactly.
But then the GPs have got 10 minutes.
They do have 10 minutes, and I think I've had experience with some amazing doctors and nurses, and but equally I've had some pretty bad experiences with them.
Yeah, and unfortunately that is a common story as well. It's not just a few people who experience this. Lots of people are experiencing kind of doctor prejudice, and that's stopping them from necessarily getting the help that they need.
There's also an assumption, which I know from my mother's experience, my late mother, if you're quite overweight, I mean, she was like 20 odd stone, 5'1", and the assumption was, yes, everything is your weight, whatever's wrong. She probably needed a hip replacement, which they probably wouldn't have been able to do because of weight, but everything was, no, it's your weight, it's your weight. But also there's the assumption that you're thick. There's a lot of people assume that if you're overweight, you're not as bright as other people. You can't possibly have a great career or a great active mind or be an academic or whatever. You somehow haven't got the same level of intelligence just because you're fat. And sadly, that does come across from some of the medical people, the general public as well. It can do.
Oh, V, I think you have something to add to that.
Yeah, just adding on to some things that Ruth said. The amount of times I've been nodding here and growling at things you've been saying, agreeing with everything you're saying, just getting annoyed at it. But about how people, how medical professionals want to fit you in a box. And so Ruth mentioned about how she has clients that come to her and they're wanting to lose weight, but the weight might be an issue that's hiding a bigger issue such as abuse. Yeah. But it's not always bigger people that have been abused. It might be someone who may have had, someone who's desperately trying to lose weight because they want to make themselves less feminine, and it's about not assuming we all fit in a box, that it's different for everybody. And I understand that doctors can't spend more than 10 minutes with us, but it's also important that they do see that we're all individuals and we're not a one size fits all. And again, with what we said about the judgments about people in larger bodies being particular ways. I mean, I know personally for me, I'm often, by medical professionals, I'm often judged on my size, and then I tell them that I teach dance and I do all these other things. It's like, oh, well, and they're confused because obviously I should not be a dance teacher because I'm far too big. And it's about changing people's perceptions and bringing in more of the health at every size, getting more people aware of that. And this is obviously something we can't do overnight. It's something we all need to build on. But it's so many, like so many of the things you're saying, like I said, it's just, I'm sort of wishing we had emojis so that I could respond to everything, but you'd have seen lots of little angry faces coming up.
I'm just imagining devil's horns everywhere going,
Yeah.
I've got a couple more quotes from the chief exec of Beat, and also what was it? The Professor Tim Kendall, which is a senior mental health advisor for the NHS. So just kind of reiterate the point that the intention is there with the medical profession and within the NHS. So Tim Kendall said, to be told you're not thin enough is almost an incitement to get worse. It's like someone going to their GP and being told, you drink 1 bottle of whiskey right now, come back when you drink 2. And there's also kind of other ones as well. So if you discover that you have cancer or you have a lump, to come back when it's bigger, because you can't get treatment now. The way that it goes is that often eating difficulties and eating disorders get worse. It's linear.
You have to be at crisis point before you get help.
Yeah, absolutely. And catching it soon is so important. So the idea that you're not sick enough is so damaging, and it's damaging to the media as well. We'll speak about that probably. So the NHS, that was the NHS guy, and then there was another one which was from the chief executive Beat, which is when somebody is told that they don't meet criteria or they aren't ill enough yet, it only encourages the eating disorder to take hold, ultimately putting more distance between the individual and recovery. Not to mention the increased cost of the health services. We can't continue to wait until an eating disorder is life-threatening before treatment is available. So it's good that this is being encouraged as an idea, but it needs to be wider, it needs to be broader. And people need to be encouraged to not use sick enough as a metric for when you should get help.
Yeah, definitely. I think standing on that one was when there's been failings. I think there's been quite a lot of the Avril Hart case, wasn't there, where she was an emergency case, but she ended up losing her life from the disorder. But I think the cleaner was the one that identified the issue and how difficult the issue had become for her, and was the only one that really kind of pushed for her, despite having seen the doctor a few weeks beforehand. And she was very unwell, very, very unwell. But it's just about recognizing at different stages how we can help people. And the implications on the wider media. We should cover that in the sense that I think with these articles, with all of the before and after photos, it perpetuates the idea of sick enough with the before and after photos and the BMIs and what kind of weight people are when they were sick, because if I look at them and the before and after photos, I can't tell if they're still mentally struggling or not. I don't know. And they could still be struggling just as much mentally as they were in the before picture. So it's not a measure. And I think with the media saying that all the time, it just makes people so stuck on the idea that you have to be underweight to be unwell. It's frustrating. V, you're raising your hand again.
Yeah, sorry. Just something again you said there about because someone is the way they are meant to be, and I'm doing air quotes there. I've met people who've had eating disorders and they've got back to the weight that they are, again, in air quotes, meant to be. And so they're fixed, allegedly, but then they focus on something else. And sometimes it's finding another issue to deal with. And it's, again, oh, well, that person has reached what I've decided is fit, therefore they're fixed and I don't need to do anything else. But sometimes it's moving on to another issue that someone might not perceive as damaging, but it's still damaging to that person because, like you just said, in the before and after photo, you don't know what they're still struggling with just because they look what society deems as healthy.
Yeah, and that's the issue with kind of being ill being linked to weight as well, because there are binge eating disorders and bulimia which don't necessarily have the kind of lower weight diagnosis. They are no less serious, like the Osford thing. They're no less serious than anything else or any other eating disorder, and in some cases the mortality rate is higher.
Yeah. There's almost a level of competition within the community over which eating disorder to have.
It's the best one.
Which is the best one. Which is the sickest one.
Yeah. And also going back to the recovery thing, and if the metrics for recovery are based on weight restoration and behaviour, and not on the psychology of an individual, then somebody can change their behaviour, can fix their behaviour, can restore their weight, and like you said, still be just as sick, or the sickness changes be. So like what you're saying, somebody can still be unwell, but now they are more anxious, or they're getting themselves involved with other dangerous and self-destructive behaviours rather than the eating disorder.
The obvious thing to me is, if you're saying like you can be at the okay what you're supposed to be, but you're still mentally, you've got the issues. At the start of the illness, the chances are your weight was okay, and the problem had been going on in there for a while anyway, before your weight became an issue, or you started acting in a certain way with your food and diet.
And weight.
So the fact that you could be a healthy 13-year-old in every way, obviously you weren't, but you couldn't visibly see that.
Yeah, I think there was
same at the other end when you're supposedly recovered. You can't see the illness.
Yeah, I think on one of the articles or forum that I read was that they had been a healthy weight for the entirety of their illness, and that she felt like a fraud walking down the streets, and that no one would ever notice or realise, and that it was more shameful coming out because she just didn't think that anybody would take it seriously. and that when she knew of someone that was underweight, she wanted to give up her therapy time to them because she didn't feel as worthy of it as the other person. And it's that kind of thing that it shouldn't be based on it. An eating disorder is not on your weight at all. It is the way and your relationship with food.
The crazy thing is, with the NHS, it would cost so much less if there was early intervention.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know how they start or change things, but I don't know what the answer is or the solution, but you wonder whether they're looking at the bigger picture ever.
I think it's partially a time thing, and the perception is so ingrained now in both social media and in the medical professions, that your weight is intrinsically linked, that like friends and family aren't necessarily as able to identify when their loved ones are struggling because they're...
You hide it to protect them.
Pardon?
I'm guessing you hide it to protect them.
Yeah, you hide it to protect them, and also if your weight isn't low, then they're not necessarily going to, your friends and family aren't necessarily going to think, they're struggling. It's just that maybe that person is on a diet or has some interesting body image issues, but not necessarily that they require treatment.
And the same thing, like you say about friends and family, but it's also because of their perceptions and because of the media and because of the way that it's talked about, people aren't able to recognise the symptoms within themselves either.
Yeah.
With something that is very difficult to recognise even without those perceptions, it is even more difficult to recognise it now, especially with fads and trends like clean eating, and when you have Fitspo on
Tumblr and
on Instagram, where people are exercising and over exercising and focusing on certain food groups in order to gain their muscle mass. When you have athletes and you have all of these different communities around the place, with all of these fads going on that have some elements of disordered eating, especially if you get lost in it, if you get lost in clean eating, if you get lost in things. And I know orthorexia isn't classified primarily as an eating disorder in its own right.
Yeah.
It's part of OSFED, but orthorexia, when you're focusing on healthy food and you have body dysmorphia, muscle dysmorphia, bigorexia, and that applies both to girls, females and males. So there's so much going on.
It's so normalised, isn't it?
It's much more
normalised. It's not seen as an issue, and in a lot of cases it's seen as looking after yourself.
Yeah.
But as with everything, it's a sliding scale, and there are degrees of it and how it's affecting your own mental health.
Yeah.
Hi. I don't know if you can hear me. Hello. This is a very weird setup. It's just interesting what you were saying about the normalisation of eating habits. I was away on training course this week with fellow nurses, and we're all, at a point in our career where we're very experienced. But each mealtime, the focus of the conversation came back to diets and how they shouldn't be eating such and such, and they were doing certain diet things. And one lady's doing the 2 day a week, less than a certain number of calories diet. And, we're sensible professional people who are looking after other people's well-being. And I don't think we realise how normal disordered eating is. Like you were saying about the media, that's just how it is now. So it's even more difficult for people to pick up on when people are struggling as opposed to when they're just trying to shift a few pounds, because it's just everyday conversation. And I was trying to turn the conversation to sort of health at every size type thing, but it was so difficult because they're just so entrenched, and they were very aware that they were serial dieters, and they had been for donkey's years. But also what you were saying about the NHS, I think not just with eating disorders, with all mental health services in particular, that we're hemorrhaging staff, services for all mental health issues are cut down to the bare bones, and you really do have to be in crisis before you can get any sort of intensive treatment. Any sort of psychological treatment is usually 6 weeks over the phone, unless you're going to pay for it privately. But then how many 17, 18-year-olds have got the resources to pay for private therapy? I think the whole system is stretched, but I think it's very, very sad that we've got a generation of young people coming through that are struggling so much, and they just can't get the help that they need, and we're going to end up with them in crisis and picking up the pieces, which is really sad.
That's difficult as a nurse though as well.
It's hard to say. It is hard to say, and especially where we're based in the emergency department, and people do come in crisis because they've harmed themselves or they need to come in for refeeding and that sort of thing. We've had a few recently that have come in to be fed to get back up to weight, as we were just talking about. It's really sad. It's really, really sad. And
it's really important to acknowledge that the individuals within the NHS, for the most part, like, as with anything, people are doing their best.
It's a system that's very, very broken at the moment.
All GPs, even the one that kind of said that to you, they are working with their best resources, and for the most part anyway, they are doing everything that they can. It's just that the kind of culture around it, the system around it, the politics around it,
and I'm not sure how much they get trained on the impact of their statements.
No.
And if they're having a bad day or anything like that. I think if that's so difficult. It's difficult when you're the patient, and it's difficult when you're the doctor. It's very, very difficult, and you got to acknowledge it. And it's not about bashing the NHS at all. It's there is a lack of funding. There's a lack of support for people.
We just want to raise awareness, I guess, and that's why we want to have conversations like this, make sure that conversations like this are being had. Is from that point of view. But it's also it's interesting kind of going back to your training and the people that you're with on your training course, the fact that they're aware that they're serial dieters, and that kind of it's almost made into a joke for a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely. But every mouthful is like, oh, I really shouldn't be having this, and oh, I'm being so naughty. I'm like, you're eating. And I guess because I'm further along in that journey, for want of a better word, it was tough to eat your meals in that sort of environment, really, when you had issues before. But I tried the education route.
And I think that's the best that kind of we can all do, is that when we see and we hear stuff like that, and trying to be more positive and trying to make sure that you can spot when somebody's actually struggling, or when they're a serial dieter. Although I personally think that serial dieting is an issue anyway, and is disordered eating. But it's education.
Is there anything that anyone else wants to add? Because I think otherwise we will end up wrapping up.
Mm-hmm. Is there anyone that wants to kind of share their experiences?
No. Well, thank you all for coming and joining us. I hope it's been a good talk for you guys, and we will put some articles up on the Facebook page later on, some really useful ones and things that are probably worth sharing. And thank you again, and we'll post this up.
Thank you.
Thanks.